Hello, everybody. Happy Year of the Snake. My name is Rachel Parikh, and I am the Deputy Director at the Dunhuang Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our penultimate lecture, part of our Curating the Silk Roads lecture series. This series features 7 esteemed curators and with a conservator from U.S. museums, and they share their experience, expertise, and research in Silk Road studies. Tonight, presenting their lecture entitled Harvard and Dunhuang, 100 Years Later, is Dr. Sarah Laursen and Miss Angela Chang. Dr. Sarah Laursen is the Alan J. Dorsky Curator of Chinese Art at the Harvard Art Museums. She currently oversees the Chinese art collection, as well as parts of the Korean and Central, South, and Southeast Asian collections. Prior to joining the Harvard Art Museums, she was the curator of Asian art at the Middlebury College Museum of Art and assistant professor of the history of art and architecture at Middlebury College in Vermont, where she taught Asian art, museum studies, and digital humanities. She is a specialist in early medieval China and has curated and co-curated a number of exhibitions, including Objects of Addiction, Opium Empire, and the Chinese Art Trade, and Earthly Delights, 6,000 years of Asian ceramics. She received her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. Miss Angela Chang is the Assistant Director, Senior Conservator of Objects and Sculpture, and Head of the Objects Lab at the Strauss Center of Conservation and Technical Studies at the Harvard Art Museums. She's involved with all aspects of preserving objects in the museum's collections, including the treatment of three-dimensional objects, preventative care, and technical research on artist materials and techniques. In addition to her current study of the kneeling Bodhisattva sculpture from Dunhuang, other recent research topics include the manufacture and condition histories of Gandharan stucco objects and a medieval polychrome sculpture of Prince Shotoku Taishi from Japan. She received her MS from the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation. Sarah and Angela, thank you so much for speaking to us tonight.
Thank you, Rachel. And thank you everyone for joining us today, especially those of you who are getting up very early or staying up late to join us from other time zones. We'd also like to thank the Dunhuang Foundation for the invitation to speak today and for their generous support of our work at the Harvard Art Museums. Our talk today will be roughly divided into 3 sections. First, I'll introduce the history of the Dunhuang fragments at the Harvard Art Museums, including their removal from China, display in various locations at the museums, and their role in museum education. I will then turn it over to Angela, who will discuss efforts to conserve them and to understand their materials and construction through technical study. Finally, we will turn to the present day to highlight a recent 3D digitization project and the reinstallation of the fragments in the Buddhist gallery. I'd like to begin with a little history of the Fogg Museum, the earliest of the 3 museums now collectively known as the Harvard Art Museums. The original Fogg Museum was located on the north side of Harvard Yard, a short walk from the current location of the Harvard Art Museums. Funds for its establishment in 1895 were provided by Elizabeth Perkins Fogg, the widow of China trader William Hayes Fogg. The collection began modestly as a small group of artworks owned by the Foggs or gifted by professors, but by the early 1920s, it had expanded to more than 5,000 objects. Having outgrown the original museum, the collection was moved in 1927 to a new Fogg Museum at 32 Quincy Street. The teaching of art history and Asian art history both began at Harvard, and more precisely at the Fogg Museum. Professor Charles Eliot Norton gave the country's first fine arts lectures at Harvard in 1873, and art theory professor Denman Ross incorporated artworks he had collected in Asia into his art and art theory classes at Harvard in the early decades of the 20th century. Fogg Museum research associate Langdon Warner went one step further, teaching the country's first course in Asian art in 1912. As the art history curriculum grew, so too did the need for teaching collections, and this became a central concern of Edward Forbes, who served as the second director of the Fogg Museum from 1909 to 1944. Many of the masterpieces of Asian art we associate with the Harvard Art Museums today actually entered the collection later through the bequest of alumnus Grenville Winthrop in 1943. This growing interest in Asian art coincided with new discoveries in China that were making international news. In 1900, the caretaker of the Mogao Caves, Wang Yuanlu, had accidentally uncovered the sealed library cave, revealing a cache of more than 50,000 manuscripts, paintings, banners, and other objects. Beginning in 1907, Wang sold many of these materials to explorers and scholars from other countries to pay for restorations to the site. Sir Aurel Stein, a Hungarian explorer representing Britain, visited in 1907 and collected manuscripts and paintings that are now housed in the British Library. Paul Pelliot, on the right, visited in 1908, collecting texts that are now housed in the Bibliothèque Nationale in France. Many of the remaining manuscripts had been transported to Beijing for safekeeping in 1910, but enough remained on the market that in the 1920s, Paul Pelliot advised the Fogg Museum to pursue acquisitions from Dunhuang as well. In fact, we do have additional painting scrolls, banners, and sutras from the site, which were purchased or gifted at later dates. But these are not the focus of tonight's talk. Forbes began hatching a plan to increase the holdings in Chinese art at the museum through a Fogg expedition to China, and he called upon an old family friend, Langdon Warner, to lead it. Warner had graduated from Harvard College in 1903 and returned to study archaeology in 1905. At the time, Warner was director of the Pennsylvania Museum of Art, now the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and he brought his colleague, Horace Jane, with him. They arrived in Beijing in 1923 and in Dunhuang in western China in January of 1924. The expedition also included stops in Inner Mongolia and another site in Gansu province, but we are not discussing those at the moment either. They finally arrived at the Mogao Peerless Caves, carved into the cliff face along the Dachuan River near Dunhuang. The 492 caves contain more than 45,000 square meters of wall painting and 2,000 sculptures made between the 4th and 14th centuries. This is one of Warner's photographs of the site in early 1924. As you can see, many of the caves were missing their facades and had been heavily damaged by the elements and by local and foreign visitors, including the White Russian soldiers who took refuge in the caves after the Russian Revolution. Aware that many of the manuscripts had already been removed, Warner came prepared to remove wall paintings instead of manuscripts. Angela will discuss this process in more detail a little bit later. In the end, Warner left the site with 12 heavily damaged painting fragments, only 11 of which survive today. The 2 fragments from Cave 320 displayed here are among the best preserved. It's clear from his books and private correspondence that Warner felt that protecting a few fragments for posterity justified the damage to the site. He wrote, quote, "As for the morals of such vandalism, I would strip the place bare without a flicker. Who knows when Chinese troops may be quartered here as the Russians were? In 20 years, this place won't be worth a visit. Every pilgrim scratches his ill-born name and flicks off a piece of trembling plaster." End quote. In addition, Warner removed a kneeling attendant bodhisattva from Cave 328, pictured here. In the case of this sculpture, Warner expressed more hesitation and awareness of the irreversible injury he had caused to the site. He wrote, "Thus it was that I was enabled to set about a labor of love and reverently pry from its pedestal a figure halting upon one knee, and with sensitive hands clasped in adoration before its bosom. No vandal hand but mine had disturbed it for 1,100 years. He wrote of his efforts to protect this sculpture on its journey back to the US, sacrificing as much clothing as he could, including his boxer shorts, to provide additional padding and protect it. It arrived in surprisingly good condition considering its unfired clay materials. It was soon exhibited in the old Fogg on the north side of Harvard Yard and then in the new Fogg in the current building, and eventually across the street from the Fogg when the Sackler Museum opened in 1985, and the Asian collections were transferred there. Since the Fogg, Sackler, and Busch-Reisinger were moved into a single building in 2014, the sculpture and a small selection of painting fragments have remained on view in the Buddhist gallery on the second floor. I first encountered these works in the Sackler Museum, though, when I worked on an inventory of the collection from 2002 to 2004. Just after leaving that position at the museums, I visited Dunhuang for the first time for the Second International Conference on the Conservation of Grotto Sites in 2004. The absence of one of the four kneeling attendant bodhisattvas was hard to miss, and it left an impression on me. At the conference, I met a young conservator named Sanchita Balachandran, who had been working at Harvard's Strauss Center for Conservation and Technical Studies. A few years later, she wrote an important article called Object Lessons that critically unpacked the removal of the wall paintings and sculpture from the Mogao Caves. You may recognize this sculpture that sat on the gates outside our hotel as a reminder to foreign tourists of what was lost. I returned as a graduate student in 2008 for the Silk Road Foundation Dunhuang Seminar, visiting more than 100 caves over the course of a week. In my notebook from that trip, I made a note about Cave 328. Langdon Warner took the kneeling figure from this cave, left side. When I came back to Harvard as a curator in 2020, I was struck by the lack of context provided for these objects in the galleries. They were presented in frames as though they were complete and bore titles like Bust of a Bodhisattva, implying that they were intentionally cropped. The Dunhuang materials art featured heavily in teaching, both in the galleries and during visits to the Art Study Center, the space pictured here where visitors can observe artworks up close. During classes and tours, students often gave impassioned critiques of the museum for retaining the Dunhuang materials. I was glad to hear the students vocalizing their concerns, but I was troubled that the collecting history often overshadowed the importance of the site. I realized we needed a new approach to exhibiting the fragments, one that would immediately give a sense of their art historical importance without shying away from how they had gotten here. In 2021, I began working on an exhibition called Objects of Addiction, Opium Empire, and the Chinese Art Trade, which considered Bostonians' role in the opium trade and the rush for ancient Chinese art treasures in the United States in the early 20th century. In the exhibition, we displayed wall painting fragments alongside a large photo mural, whose image had been supplied by the Dunhuang Academy, the overseers of the site for the last 80 years. This was possible through the efforts of the Dunhuang Foundation, which supported the exhibition and worked hard to foster communication between the Harvard Art Museums and the Academy. This was an impactful part of the exhibition and always the site of lively conversations with visitors about the ethics of collecting. The exhibition opened the door to a larger discussion about these fragments and how we wanted them to be exhibited and shared with the world. In April of last year, we briefly took the kneeling bodhisattva off view in order to take x-rays and do more sampling in the lab, and to meet with colleagues about producing a 3D model that we could share with the public. The following month, with the help of Chris Hudak, the director of the Dunhuang Foundation, Angela and I were able to visit Dunhuang and meet with members of the Dunhuang Academy. It felt like a significant moment to begin a dialogue. We arrived 100 years to the week after the Dunhuang fragments had reached Cambridge. We were warmly welcomed and taken on tours of the Dunhuang Academy, which was founded in 1944 and is now effectively a small city with a staff of more than 1,000 people. Here you can see the contrast between the state of the caves when Warner visited and when we visited. I was amazed to see how much the site has grown and the variety of experiences that are offered to visitors. The site receives 6,000 visitors a day, or 18,000 in high season. Because of concerns about the impact of visitors on the caves, most tours are limited to a small number of caves and just 3 minutes inside each one. However, experiences are supplemented by virtual tours, like this introductory video in an IMAX-like theater. For decades, the Academy has also been producing replica caves like this one, which allow visitors to interact with the caves safely and in better lighting. The exhibition center also featured installations focused on construction materials and techniques. Other virtual experiences make use of an Oculus or a green screen that place visitors inside the caves. And I hope if you visit, you get an opportunity to try this one out. As we visited nearby sites like the Dunhuang City Museum and Yumen Pass, we were reminded that the fragments now in foreign collections, that because of the fragments now in foreign collections, much work lies ahead to rectify the mistakes of the past. So now I'll turn it over to Angela to share more about our travels and her work with the Dunhuang materials at Harvard.
Thank you, Sarah, and hi, everybody out there. Today, I'll discuss the fragments' physical and material histories, starting with their removal and restoration, and then highlighting recent technical research that aims to understand their original materials and manufacture. First, I thought it might be helpful to introduce briefly our conservation department and its history. In 1928, Fogg Museum director Edward Waldo Forbes founded the Department of Technical Research, the first conservation lab in the U.S. Mr. Forbes wanted to understand art through scientific research and experimentation. In particular, he wanted to know how and why some materials changed over time, and how to better preserve cultural objects. He hired the first chemist in an art museum, Dr. Rutherford Gettens, shown on the right. Now called the Strauss Center for Conservation and Technical Studies, we remain dedicated to fine arts conservation, research, teaching, and training. The lab is located on the glassy fourth and fifth floors of the Harvard Art Museums. We care for the objects in our collection through documentation, treatment, and preventive measures such as ensuring a stable environment. Technical studies, in our name, refers to the specialized research of the materials and technology used to make art across time and cultures. This is applied to making decisions about preservation and access to the museum's collections and related objects worldwide. We also seek to integrate this material perspective with an object's history and interpretation. The Strauss Center has 4 specialty labs: paintings, 3D objects, works on paper, and conservation science. The staff consists of about 20 conservators, scientists, fellows, and technicians. Our work is necessarily collaborative. We work closely with curators and other art historians, scientists, artists, and imaging specialists, to name a few. Forbes aspired to make the Fogg into a laboratory for art and a training ground for museum professionals. Since the 1970s, the lab has trained new conservators, and we teach university students from many disciplines. We also work closely with the museum's Materials Lab, which is a space that offers workshops to students and visitors to learn about art through making. So now returning to Dunhuang, how were the fragments removed? First, I should note that Langdon Warner, an archaeologist and art historian, was not knowledgeable about removing wall paintings. He relied on instruction from a young restorer, Daniel Thompson, who had trained in the Italian fresco removal technique called strappo, which is derived from the verb strappare, which means to tear or rip. Adopting this technique, Warner first applied a wash of milk as a fixative to the selected sections of the painting. His 1924 picture here probably shows the resulting darkening. Next, he applied cloths coated with warm animal glue. After they set, the strongly bonded facing cloths were meant to be peeled away with the paint layer attached. The plan was for the faced fragments to be shipped to the Fogg, where the paint layer would then be transferred onto a new support. This process relies on both the success of the cloth adhering fully and then the removability of the glue without affecting the original paint. Unfortunately, both steps prove to be very damaging. In the first step, the cold conditions of the cave made the milk and animal glue solidify too quickly and bond poorly, leaving remnants of the paint and ground on the wall when the cloths were pulled away. When Sarah and I visited Dunhuang in May, we could see drips around these areas as well as ghosts of the images from the paint and ground that remains on the walls. At the Fogg, it was clear that Daniel Thompson struggled to remove the facing from fragments. He backed them with silk or mulberry paper, adhered with a casein and lime solution, and then he ironed the layers together. He used hot water to remove the cloth from the front, but the animal glue's similarity to the paint medium made it difficult to separate the paint. In 2004, then conservation intern Sanchita Balachandran carried out a significant research project on some of the painting fragments and facing cloths shown here. Comparing them to the painting fragments, she concluded that nearly half of the original pigment remained on the cloth after it was transferred onto a support. So the paintings were damaged during their initial removal as well as the later transfer. Years later, in 1942, this painting fragment, which was not mounted to a board, was further treated by another conservator. He found the fragment severely distorted and damaged from Thompson's casein adhesive. If you look at the raking light image in the middle, you can sort of see the topography of the fragment. He softened the fragment with solvents and then ironed and adhered it onto a board. These early restoration techniques were very invasive, causing irreparable damage. The images we see now are heavily restored. Modern conservation practices take a very different approach, focused on preservation, ethics, and considering the object's origins. In addition to the painting fragments, Warner removed the kneeling bodhisattva from the niche in cave 328. The base was heavily damaged in the process, though he saved the separated lotus petals. It was undoubtedly further harmed during its long journey to the US. We now see many repairs on the sculpture, though the archival image outside the cave shows the sculpture largely intact. There's no documentation of the early restoration work done on the bodhisattva, whether at Dunhuang or later. The painting and sculpture fragments from Dunhuang prompted some of the earliest conservation research by the museum's scientific laboratory. At the Fogg, Gettens made a thorough study of the kneeling bodhisattva's pigments in the 1930s. These pictures show his careful documentation. He analyzed the pigments and media to identify their composition and to understand where they came from, whether from local sources or from elsewhere on the Silk Road. He used microscopy and microchemical tests to identify the pigments, and his findings remain important references to us today. The Strauss Center's research on the Dunhuang materials restarted about 20 years ago with Balachandran's work, and my involvement began only very recently. Now I'll highlight the work of over a dozen conservators and scientists from the Strauss Center on the kneeling bodhisattva. As many of you know, the sculptures at Dunhuang were constructed of an earthen plaster applied to an armature of wood or bundled reeds. The plaster was built up in layers like the paintings, starting with a coarse plaster that contained a lot of fibers, followed by a fine plaster layer, ground, and paint layers. We're interested in how these materials and techniques were used for this sculpture. Technical studies begin with close looking. Here we can see how the two sides of the figure were decorated very differently. The right side, facing the viewer and the cave entrance, was ornately painted with extensive gilded decoration, while the left side had a simple paint scheme. We noted that the condition of the white paint on the two sides of the figure also appeared different. On the right side, the white paint has patchy, darkened areas. You can see this especially on the right side of the face. And the left side does not show this as much. In the archival images, this contrast is visible on all the sculptures in the niche. The sides of the sculptures that face the cave entrance all exhibit this darkening. Tool marks can show us how some details were created. For example, to form some drapery folds, the artist marked their position with lines in a flat sheet of plaster and then added another layer of plaster to form a crease. In the waistband, shown on the bottom, incised lines were used to create a decorative pattern. It looks like the plaster was the consistency of a soft clay, capturing the artist's fingerprints. We often examine objects under UV light to identify differences in their media or condition. The cool white areas seen in the UV image on the right are an adhesive used to join breaks across the arm and wrist, and the pale yellow areas correspond to a cellulose nitrate coating. This material was available in the early 20th century as a lacquer or adhesive, and Gittins identified it in 1936. So the sculpture could have been treated before Warner removed it. In the archival image outside the cave, the figure looks pretty intact, as I mentioned before. We use X-radiography to examine the internal structure and condition of an object. In the X-ray on the right, we can see clearly the internal wooden armature. It appears darker in the X-ray because the wood is less dense than the solid mud plaster. We can also see the clumpy texture of the mud plaster mixture and some internal cracks. In the knee and shoulders, the X-rays show how smaller pieces of wood were lashed together. This is similar to the models that are shown at the Dunhuang Visitor Center. And in the right hand, there is a repair using a modern pin. Another analytical technique our scientists use is XRF, short for X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy. It can identify the inorganic elements present on a surface, such as the components of a pigment or the metals in an alloy. Using XRF and X-ray together, we discovered copper inlays in the eyes. The X-ray shows thin curved sheets of metal, and XRF detected the high copper content of these sheets. XRF also helped us to identify 3 different red pigments applied to the skirt: red lead, vermilion or cinnabar, and red ochre. These pigments are consistent with those found on the cave paintings. And to me, the use of 3 different reds on one figure shows how nuanced the color schemes were. We use scanning electron microscope to study the microstructure of a sample, identify elements present, and show their distribution. It requires a tiny sample about the size of a period on a printed page. We mount the sample in polyester to examine the layers. So on the bottom left is an example of a mounted sample. The sample itself is really just a speck in that cube that looks like an ice cube. In this example on the right, from the blue on the figure's knee, we found the pigment azurite applied over a layer of red and white paint. The optical image shown in the middle shows some gold leaf, surprisingly, on the top of the blue, with organic red and lead white layers below. And at the bottom right, the electron image shows how the gold is actually crumpled up, and also how the azurite particles are quite coarse. The seated bodhisattva has many gilded details in the jewelry and robes. The pattern on the skirt includes multiple gold stripes. We found that the composition and application of gold was varied. It's hard to say whether this was intended to create visual effects or just a result of having inconsistent materials. Gold with higher silver content appears very tarnished and dark, and this helps to explain why many of the areas of gold are difficult to discern. So the pigments, gold, and layered construction that we've observed on the sculpture and paintings is consistent with other research findings of paintings at Dunhuang. It's very special to see up close how these materials are applied to the fragments at Harvard. Our research is still in progress. Some of the areas that we continue to work on are further analysis of pigments, gilding, and media to understand their chemistry and alterations, and clarifying the restoration history of the fragments and what this means for their continued preservation and interpretation. So before handing the microphone back to Sarah, I wanted to return to our visit to Dunhuang and some of my own highlights about that I learned about preservation at Dunhuang. I'm used to conservation in a really controlled museum environment, so it was very exciting to think about the preservation of a cliff site and painted cave interiors. This is just necessarily very different. Some of the facilities at Dunhuang are really impressive. These are critical to their conservation efforts. On the left is the Academy's multi-field coupling environmental laboratory of immovable heritage. Here, scientists conduct weathering experiments to test huge samples of Earth from cave sites under simulated extreme weather conditions. And on the right, the Academy's Environmental Monitoring Center is an equally impressive place. The most important preservation measure at Dunhuang is maintaining a stable environment inside the caves. Of course, the spaces are very small, and an influx of visitors changes the condition space very rapidly. They are monitoring temperature, relative humidity, carbon dioxide, and rainfall. At specific thresholds for high relative humidity and CO2, they might respond by temporarily closing specific caves. This is because high RH and CO2 together can make the air very acidic and harm the paintings. And of course, it could also be unsafe for the visitors. Creating replicas is an important aspect of preservation and conservation at Dunhuang. The reproduction of images and texts has traditionally been a part of Buddhist religious practices, and at Dunhuang, sort of a formal tradition started in 1941. Copyists or replication artists recreate paintings and sculpture using traditional materials and techniques to preserve fragile imagery, as well as the artistic practices and knowledge. It also means to spread Dunhuang culture in exhibitions around the world. Replication, though, is not done as we might imagine here in the US, where we might attempt to reconstruct or approximate the original work of art and how it used to look. Instead, at Dunhuang, the primary mode of replication records the painting's current state. Artists reconstruct original brushstrokes and colors as they appear now. They also copy damages to convey the condition and history of the paintings to the visitors. Complementing replication, documentation through digitization is a critical means of preservation. They have been capturing digital images for over 30 years. They have about 120 staff in this department, and they have captured over 290 of the caves. If you aren't familiar already, I encourage you to check out edunhuang.com to see the work of the Digitization Institute. You can move and rotate and zoom within the space, and it offers a few advantages over being in the caves, namely full lighting, a lot of time, and the ability to zoom in and see fine details. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Sarah.
Thank you, Angela. So one of our key takeaways from the trip was a better understanding of how these artworks looked in the caves. Our kneeling bodhisattva has, since 2014, been positioned frontally, mirroring the figure of Prince Shotoku, who stands in front of it with hands pressed together in Anjali Mudra. However, in the caves, the bodhisattva is a subsidiary figure who is turned towards the Buddha in reverence. Upon our return, Angela made the wonderful suggestion to rotate the figure to better approximate its position in the cave. This had an immediate impact on the room, improving the sightline and connecting the sculpture more closely to the wall painting fragments. At the same time, our colleagues began working on creating a photogrammetric model of the sculpture. First, the sculpture had to be moved using a plywood platform specially built by our exhibitions team. Because of the fragility of the unfired clay plaster, it could only be moved once from the pedestal to the platform for imaging and conservation. The sculpture had to be exactly centered on the platform for object safety and for the integrity of the scan. These steps alone took weeks of planning. Next, the museum's digital imaging and visual resources team and Harvard Library's imaging services team began making the model. Photogrammetry is a process for creating 3D models of objects or spaces by shooting many overlapping photos from different angles. Software detects overlapping points within the photos and stitches them together into a cohesive form. To create a detailed, accurate model, photographs should be taken at regular intervals around the object at different heights. This can be done by moving around the object, or better yet, by placing it on a turntable and rotating it in 10-degree increments at multiple camera distances and heights. In the image on the screen on the right, the blue rectangles represent the distances and positions of each of the photographs taken of the sculpture. Once the photographs have been uploaded, the photogrammetry software, in this case Metashape by Agisoft, recognizes the points of overlap in the photos and calculates their distances and positions relative to each other. It first creates a point cloud, which is not pictured here, of the overlapping points or vertices. Next, it connects the points to create faces. Together, these form a mesh approximating the surface of the object. This three-dimensional shape is called the object's geometry. The color and surface details from the photos, which are together referred to as the texture, can then be projected onto those faces. The final model was created using 1,036 still images taken over the course of a week, and it took the software 11 hours to process the full resolution model. This is a preview of the final result. I apologize for the choppy videos. Manipulating 3D forms using a trackpad is actually much harder than it looks. And Rachel will also share a link to the model on Sketchfab. It was uploaded this week, and it's available at a higher resolution than you see here for free download. So we hope you'll take advantage of that. The museum also took this opportunity to refresh our decade-old images of the sculpture using a recently acquired 100 megapixel Hasselblad camera to get the highest resolution possible. As with all objects that come into the imaging studio, they aim to make an accurate representation of the object following best practices for cultural heritage imaging standards. They use color-calibrated monitors to view the digital files. The digital files are then color matched to the actual object, which is placed under a proofing light that matches the color temperature of the monitor. They captured 8 main views and 9 details, made contrast and color adjustments, and cropped and sharpened the final images using Adobe Photoshop. After the completion of this imaging project, Director Sue Bomin and other staff from the Dunhuang Academy came and visited the Harvard Art Museums. In addition to visiting the galleries, they also viewed Dunhuang fragments, not regularly on view, up in the Art Study Center. Director Sue met with our new director, Sarah Laursen, presenting her with this hand scroll depicting a wall painting from Cave 257 and ushering in what we hope will be many years of collaboration. We discussed opportunities for the exchange of art historical research, scientific findings, and image data, and we all agreed that it is our responsibility to share knowledge about shared cultural heritage in any way possible. And that begins in the galleries. In December, our exhibition team deinstalled the painting fragments, removed the built-in case on the right side wall, patched the wall, and installed a new custom-made panel with a large-scale photo mural of Cave 320. Today, this is what you will see when you visit. The wall begins with an introduction to the later Buddhist art gallery, as well as an overview of the Mogao Caves. On the left wall is a temporary 6-month installation featuring portable artworks believed to be from Dunhuang. These works are now featured on the Dunhuang Academy's digital library cave site as well. Continuing on your right, you'll see the first of the wall painting fragments, a scene of 8 men ferrying a statue of the Buddha from cave 323. A QR code at the bottom of the label links to a full image of the wall from which it was removed. Beyond that is the panel with a photo mural from cave 320. The 2 framed painting fragments have been placed on top of a repeating Thousand Buddha motif on the sides. We've often been asked why we did not place the painting fragments directly on top of the area they were removed from. There are 2 main reasons for this. First, one of the past conservation treatments involved mounting the fragments on boards that extend underneath the tan-colored mat that surround them, which prevents us from reframing the work with a smaller border. That means that the mats and frames would have blocked much of the central Buddha figure and surrounding figures, obscuring the original context. The second reason is that we would lose the opportunity to compare the area of loss to the painting itself. Not only does this side-by-side comparison allow us to see how incomplete and damaging the removal was, it also reveals the underpainting and the fact that the design was likely transferred onto the wall using a pounce, a sheet of paper that has been pierced so that the charcoal can be tapped through the holes, creating an outline for the artist to work from. This project, which was also generously funded by the Dunhuang Foundation, has been the culmination of years of research, planning, and cooperation. We're thrilled with the results, and we look forward to welcoming you to the Harvard Art Museum so that you can experience it too. We have many, many people to thank, and we have listed just a few here. But now we want to hear from you and have some time to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Angela, for such an exciting talk. I've learned so much from both of you, and my head is just spinning with questions, but I want to give people the opportunity to ask questions for Sarah and Angela with regard to Harvard and Dunhuang, and also your new galleries. Congratulations. It looks beautiful. And I also cannot believe what a difference it makes in shifting that sculpture. So I look forward to seeing it in person. But while we, okay, I'm just seeing if we have a question come up. What is the significance of using the copper in the eyes? Is there a cultural significance, or is it more of a practical use in terms of its position in the sculpture?
I'm not sure which of us.
I think maybe a question for both of you.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe Sarah can speak to the cultural significance, but metal inlay in the eye, sort of practically speaking, would reflect light in a dark space, especially with light coming in from the opposite wall. On the other hand, copper oxidizes really quickly. It turns black and matte. It's part of the reason we can't see it now. So I'm not sure how well that functions. So maybe there is more to it, symbolically that Sarah could speak to.
I'm not sure that I'm aware of a symbolic meaning behind the use of copper. It is something we see occasionally in other types of adornments. And certainly in other parts of the Buddhist world, we'll see inset glass eyes that might carry some additional symbolic meaning. But my guess in this case would also be that this was more a matter of reflecting light using a sort of a semi-precious material, not gold or silver, but something that's still a little bit more precious, and just something that's a little practical and easily worked.
Right. And how were the caves lit? So if we're talking about light refraction, for example, how were they then lit so that you could notice these kind of really subtle but beautiful nuanced details?
That is an excellent question that people have been trying to answer for a very long time.
Yeah.
So there's a fair amount of debate over how much these caves actually would have been actively used and worshipped in. For example, they actually are on very different scales. So while some of them are giant and cavernous, a few of them are just a couple feet by a couple of feet
Right.
and probably weren't actually entered. So you would assume candlelight would have been used in the caves when they were visited. And we know that especially when caves were dedicated to family members, you know, later generations would come back and visit the caves. But there are some speculations that certain caves were actually designed as sort of self-operating devices. The creation of the decoration was set into motion, a sort of process of worship and devotion that would continue on regardless of who was there or not there or the light source. So in those cases, the practicality of light wasn't actually that important. But interestingly, some light does come in from the entrance. It really depends on the time of day and the conditions. But sometimes it's actually a rather surprising amount.
Yeah.
And you could imagine it glinting off eyes on usually the recessed niche that held sculpture is opposite the entry door.
Right.
So it's possible.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Next question that we have is, have researchers traced the origins of the materials used in the cave paintings?
You want to handle that one?
Sure. They have traced many of the origins. For one thing, the mud plaster that's used on the walls and for the sculpture has been traced back by other researchers to the local river. Sort of the silt in the riverbed itself being the perfect material and handy since they had to use so much of it. That it was a very local source. And as far as the pigments go, some of them are definitely not local, but would have come from, earlier on the different parts of the Silk Roads, and which makes a lot of sense for what we know. So I don't know all of it yet, but certainly some of it's local and some of it has come from faraway places.
Yeah, and that would make sense, especially since Dunhuang was such a major site along the Silk Road and embraced so many different cultures, religions, languages, artistic styles, and of course, materials. Thank you, Angela.
Yeah, I mean, we think of spices being valuable and traveling along Silk Road, but pigments were extremely valuable.
Exactly.
Yeah, equally.
Yeah. And I also just love from your discussion talking about the nuances with the reds, for example. I thought that was really fascinating. And I'm sure, as different materials started to come into the region, they wanted to also incorporate those particular materials into their paintings and also the sculpture as well. That's fascinating. Thank you. Next question is, do we know why Warner selected these and other particular portions of the mural to remove? Was there a larger plan? Any aesthetic considerations?
That's a great question, and something we were asking ourselves a lot while we were in the caves. It's interesting that of the fragments that he took, there are no major central Buddha icons. And I think, in his way, he was actually trying to take subsidiary figures or like adoring figures surrounding a central figure. Perhaps that was to avoid removing the most revered figure, but we also know that he was very interested in a lot of the ornamentation of the Bodhisattva figures, which we don't see on Buddha figures. Interestingly, if you sort of look at the layout of the site, he didn't move that far around the site. It's quite a sizable walk from one end to the other, and he was really just within a few caves. And he was somewhat limited by the fact that, today we can go to the upper level caves. The facades have been restored. We have stairs. But not all of the caves were accessible to him at the time.
Thank you. Next question is, comparing the early photos with the current caves, this attendee wonders how much of them were reconstructed.
That is an interesting question. I'm not sure we would be the best suited to answer that. I think actually the Academy and Foundation might be able to answer that better. We did learn while we were there that there's a fascinating project that the Information Center was working on. There was a volume that was comparing some of the early, I think it might have been the photography from the Law Archive in the 1940s to the degradation of some of the pigments and the wall paintings today to try to get some insight about how things changed over time. Do you have anything to add to that, Angela?
Sorry, I don't.
That's okay.
No, that's fine. Thank you so much. We have a couple more minutes, so we're going to answer these next two questions. The first one is, can you explain in more detail how and why cooked milk was used in the paintings in the caves, and what type of animal milk was it?
This is a good question. I don't know that it was cooked milk, and I don't know what kind of animal it was. I'm guessing it was something local. But the reason milk would have been used is that protein in milk can act as a binder. Casein paint is a medium for a kind of paint that's water soluble, that's very quick drying. It dries sort of matte. And I believe that's what was happening here. Warner was applying it as a consolidant, which means he was trying to strengthen the surface to prepare it for the next step, to kind of make sure any flakes and things were stronger than they in preparation for the facing layer and the glue. So that's my understanding of it.
No, that's fascinating.
It's not something we've actually tested on our fragments yet, so I'm curious to see if we can detect that.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. And then we'll have to invite you both back.
Species.
Yeah, exactly. And then we'll invite you both back for another talk. It'll be Harvard and Dunhuang Part 2. Another question that we have is, and we'll conclude with this one, what was the relation between the sculptures, images, and texts of Dunhuang? Are there inscriptions that cite specific scriptures, for instance?
I know there are a lot of people who are specialists and who are more qualified to answer this one than me. But there's a huge range of the kinds of images we see. So in the early period, like in the Northern Dynasty, 16 Kingdoms and Northern Dynasties period, we're seeing more images of Maitreya, for example, around this sort of Maitreya cult that develops a little before that. We're seeing images of Jatakas. So these are stories of past lives of the Buddha, which also have been written down. And interestingly, in some cases, those are in long horizontal registers, and they almost read like hand scrolls. But then in the Tang period, we start to see new kinds of images. We see these large tableaus, like the one we saw in Cave 320, where there will be a central Buddha figure in paradise, surrounded sometimes by the architecture of paradise with dancers and performers and musicians arrayed before them, and sometimes a pond that has lotuses with little reborn souls popping up. So those ones often are based very loosely on descriptions of the heavens and certain paradises in sutras, which are these, pretty much all Buddhist texts are much past the life of the Buddha. So, there's no transcribing of the words of the Buddha, but a lot of them are based on important scriptures like the Lotus Sutra, for example.
And these worshipers to come to the cave would have recognized them just based on their knowledge of the sutras and their own personal connection between scripture and image, correct?
I think so. I mean, I
Okay.
think one question is kind of whether people were visiting to see other, like, in the case of a family practice, if your family had commissioned the creation of this cave, of course you would know what it depicted, you'd be more familiar. But I think there were different levels of familiarity. And keep in mind, there's also like a Buddhist establishment that was these often the intermediaries who were the ones, maybe they weren't the ones creating it, but I'm not sure that every visitor, every merchant passing through would necessarily
Right.
be able to like parse the most complicated sutras. But I think especially in images like the Jataka tales, those would have been, or like a very typical Buddha figure flanked by bodhisattvas, that might have been more approachable.
Yeah, I think my brain just went to thinking about the images at like Notre Dame or Sainte-Chapelle, where you have stained glass that depict images from the Bible, and those who were unable to read it could at least kind of follow the stories through images. So that's where my brain kind of went off to, which is why I asked that question. Thanks so much, Sarah.
And of course, that starts in India with this.
Yeah, exactly. We have one more question that we can answer, and it is, are there reconstructions that would reveal the paintings as they would have been seen by pilgrims or families?
That's a good question because, as Angela pointed out, I think a lot of them are reconstructing things as they exist today.
Right.
What do you think?
I think they do both. I
Mm,
mean, the one I described is sort of the the most predominant type of reconstruction that is done at Dunhuang, but they have other names and I can't remember what they are, but there are reconstructions that approximate the original state of the paintings, the colors before they've changed,
yeah,
not so dusty, not so, abraded or
right.
worn. So I think those definitely exist. And it's great to see both, frankly. I mean, they talk about the reconstructions of the current state to kind of show how these are continue to be living paintings, living objects,
Yeah.
and we can still appreciate what we understand to be the original.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, I cannot thank you both enough, Sarah and Angela, for such a wonderful and insightful and informative talk. I encourage you all to go out to visit the Harvard Art Museums to see their new beautiful installation and these objects in person. Our next and final lecture of this series is next week on Thursday, February 6th, and it will be given by Dr. Kit Brooks, who is the curator of Asian art at the Princeton University Art Museum. Their lecture, entitled Tickling the Senses, Curatorial Strategies in Io's Happy Rainbow Hell, will look into how Dr. Brooks conveyed tactile dimensions of Io's work in the first ever exhibition in the United States dedicated to the Japanese Fluxus artist. So I hope that you can all join us for that as well. But again, thank you to our wonderful speakers, Angela and Sarah, and thank you all for joining us this evening. Again, best wishes for the Year of the Snake and have a great evening. Thank you again. Bye, everyone. Bye, Sarah. Bye, Angela. Thank you.